My name is Jaedyn Starr and I'm transgender, and I'm really passionate about gender inclusion, and this video is going to include two parts. One that's around awareness of gender inclusion, and the second piece will be around action, what teachers can do to work towards more gender inclusive classrooms. And to start off the awareness piece, I'd like to introduce us to the concept of unlearning gender. And so unlearning would be taking something that we are already familiar with, such as if we think of washrooms, having boys' washrooms, girls' washrooms, and unlearning that, which basically means thinking about how diverse the students in our classrooms are, that maybe not every student is always going to feel comfortable using a boys' room or a girls' room. Maybe some of us might not feel like boys or girls at all. And so that's what unlearning gender would be kind of questioning what our options are for gender, which if we look at, say, the storybooks that are often used in classrooms, they tend to reproduce an understanding of gender that follows the binary, the idea that there are only two, boys and girls. And I would like to invite teachers to question this binary, because we have students who are transgender, who are genderqueer, who are gender fluid. They may not feel like the same gender every day when they come into our classrooms. And being able to recognize this diversity in the work that we do as teachers is a really exciting opportunity. If I think back on my experience as a student in elementary school, high school, and I also went to university, it was never talked about gender pronouns or gender outside of the traditional ideas of boys growing up to be men and girls growing up to be women, and generally under a heteronormative idea that basically assumes that everybody is straight unless maybe they're wearing a rainbow cape. And that type of silence that kind of hovers around the people that are outside of that heteronormative way of being can be really difficult for students and for teachers and everybody in the community. And I think this is a really exciting opportunity for us to start to end that silence and talk about the diversity of our communities and have curriculums and classroom activities that reflect the diversity of the students that we're serving. And at the end of the workshop, these grade 9 girls came up to me and asked why I have this toque. And I said, because I like to wear it. And they said, you can't wear this toque. And I said, why? And they said, it's pink. And one of the girls was actually wearing blue, and I asked why she could wear blue if I can't have pink. And I put on the toque, and then the girls actually began to laugh at me for wearing this piece of clothing. And it just, it really hurt to have people laugh at me for just going outside of what they thought a boy could do. And I'm not even a boy, but should it matter if I want to wear this toque? Heteronormativity is the collection of sexual and gender norms that often play out in schools, where we assume that students are always straight unless if they come out as otherwise, and we assume that they will be cisgender or stay the same gender unless if they come out as otherwise. And These assumptions also play out with our bathroom signs that only allow space for boys and girls, and sometimes there's a really narrow idea of who can be a boy and who can be a girl. So I'd like to talk about some myths and assumptions that are often carried around gender. And so one of the biggest myths would be that we can assume somebody's gender before they're even born. A doctor may do an ultrasound and people may assume, oh, I'm going to have a girl and she's probably going to grow up to be a woman and marry a man and they're going to have babies together. And it's almost a loop that goes on and does seem accurate if you look at some people's experiences, but is definitely not inclusive of all of our experiences. So in Canada, there's the word two-spirit to apply to folks who are First Nations or Inuit or Métis and identify outside of basically straight and cisgender ways of being. So it's kind of a combination of being queer and Aboriginal. And so two-spirit would be one example of genders that go outside of the binary. Another example would be gender fluid, which would be somebody who could experience gender in different ways based on perhaps the day or maybe who they're around. Gender can be different for each person. Another example of a gender outside of the binary is gender queer, and that's basically sometimes thought of a third gender, but there's way more than 3 genders. So I don't think that would be accurate to have kind of a third final gender and then we're done, call it a day. Yeah. Another myth around gender is that in schools, the students are too young for us to talk about gender. I think when we have that type of dynamic in a school where we aren't able to talk to youth about a topic such as gender, it can create a shame and a stigma, and that can make it really hard for students to start thinking about how to actually respect the diversity of people in our community. So I would really invite all teachers to try and challenge that silence and find opportunities to welcome conversations with our students about gender and not try and just assume the norm in all of our classes. The last myth around gender deals with the fact that we could assume somebody's gender based on their name, the way that they look, the way that somebody's dressed, and this assumption actually doesn't make space for the many ways of having genders, and a student may be perceived as a boy because of their hair or their name, and the student may not have really had a choice in their name or their hair. So if we're not recognizing kind of the pressures, especially that young people who are assigned male at birth are facing in the school system to kind of man up and prove their masculinity and play on sports teams and sometimes just prove themselves, that's definitely something that's playing into our classrooms, and that I think teachers have a responsibility to make space for the diversity of our students. So as a trans teacher, I think it's really important to frame material in terms of privilege and intersectionality. And a lot of times when we talk about history, it's talked about from the European-centric perspective, which may not create an atmosphere that can feel safe to explore alternative perspectives. And if we think about gender, this is often assumed to be framed in a certain way. And you might share, say, a story about Chinese immigrants coming over and working on the railroad, and then these men would bring over their wives, and say this story assumes certain things about gender and relationships, and if, as teachers, we can recognize these assumptions and share the assumptions with the class and invite them to think about what types of assumptions we're making about the stories that might be in our textbooks or movies. If we think about the common texts that are used in high school, we think about maybe Romeo and Juliet, and these types of stories have a lot of assumptions about what a woman is, what a man is, what a relationship or a marriage is supposed to look like. And if as teachers we can be aware of these assumptions and invite our students to think about these assumptions when looking at material that might reinforce heteronormative or straight and cisgender ways of thinking about the world. This also extends to race and colonialism. If we think about 18th or 19th century history in the land that we call Canada, and the experiences of Two-Spirit people at the hands of settlers, European settlers that came over, there was actually a lot of violence that was targeted not only to First Nations people, but also to Two-Spirit people, which is a part of history that is often left out of most textbooks. And that's one example of intersectionality, or how race and colonialism, gender and sexuality can all kind of be intersecting in the experiences of people on this land in history, as well as even to this day. Another thing that we can do is support students in accessing resources that reflect the diversity of our students, such as the Switch coloring book or The Spoon Runs Away with Another Spoon, basically allowing them to access these resources, as well as providing opportunities to perhaps create additional resources. One of the things that I get really excited about as a student teacher is integrating gender inclusive material into the curriculum. So if we think about the draft grade 9 curriculum, there is discussing the impact of colonialism on Indigenous people between 18th to 20th century in Canada. And this could be an opportunity to talk about residential schools, and through residential schools there was rigid gender roles that were enforced, as well as the gender binary. So this could be an opportunity to invite students to think about heteronormativity and gender roles as it relates to Indigenous histories in Canada and Two-Spirit folks. For Social Studies 11, there is the Counterpoints textbook, which does discuss gender in a way that assumes that there are only men and women. And if you look at the curriculum as well for Socials 11, there is the same kind of assumptions about gender as only following the binary. So this could be an opportunity to incorporate thinking critically, which is one of the big ideas for Socials 11. For Social Justice 12, there's a lot of flexibility that we can use as student teachers and teachers to invite students to think critically around privilege, intersectionality, and gender. So with Social Justice 12, we could have guest speakers come in, and that could be an opportunity to bring in authentic voices of diverse experiences, because that brings a lot of value to the classroom that is often not available when it's the same teacher with the same social location in terms of gender, race, ability, all of these things. By bringing in new voices, new life experiences, this can really provide opportunities for our students to think in terms of diverse perspectives. And yeah. If I think back on my experience as a student in elementary school, high school, and I also went to university, it was never talked about gender, pronouns, or gender outside of the traditional ideas of boys growing up to be men and girls growing up to be women, and generally under a heteronormative idea that basically assumes that everybody is straight unless maybe they're wearing a rainbow cape. And that type of silence that kind of hovers around the people that are outside of that heteronormative way of being can be really difficult for students and for teachers and everybody in the community. And I think this is a really exciting opportunity for us to start to end that silence and talk about the diversity of our communities and have curriculums and classroom activities that reflect the diversity of the students that we're serving.